Hello, biology students. We're now ready to move on to our final topic of the year in biology. And so we are going to be talking about evolution. And so for this particular chapter, you will not have any problems at the end of the section to worry about, nor will you be tested over this information. And so I wanted to just take this time just to talk a little bit about some of the theories of Darwin and talk a little bit about what's going on. And so, again, there's no homework for this part, and so we're just going to be talking a little bit now about evolution. And so we'll split this up into a 4-day period of time. And so let us then start today by looking at evolution from a general standpoint. All right, evolution. It's part scientific theory, but part unconfirmed hypothesis. And so we have to be careful when we're talking about evolution to specify what type of evolution we're going to be dealing with. And so we'll get to that towards the end of this talk. All right. The man who started this whole idea of evolution is, of course, the British scientist known as Charles Darwin. And so I want to talk a little bit today about his life and his work. And so we'll focus on that today. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England, on February 12th, 1809, which coincidentally is the same date and the year that Abraham Lincoln, one of our very most important presidents, was also born on that time. Darwin ended up being born into a wealthy family, and so his parents obviously wanted him to get a good education, and so artistic enrichment was also stressed. And so typically speaking, kids who come from more affluent families tend to go to better schools, and therefore they tend to get a more rounded education. And so hopefully you guys are also getting that here at MBCA as well. In the year 1825, Darwin enrolled at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So cheeky donkey, he's in Scotland now. All right. His father, just like a lot of parents, wanted him to get into medicine so he could become a doctor. And so I became a doctor, just not of the medical type. My sister, however, did end up becoming a doctor, and she's now practicing neurology in Columbus. Fun fact. All right. Darwin, however, was sickened by surgery, and so he also showed little aptitude for the subject. And so it's important that when you're in school, if you're looking to do something, not to be either sick by the subject or show little interest in the subject. And so after just 2 years, Darwin decided to abandon the study of medicine. And so he decided to look elsewhere into things that would be of more interest to him. After leaving the study of medicine, Darwin then transferred to Christ's College in Cambridge, England, and he was going to study, and so, are you guys ready for this? He was going to study theology, which is the study of religion, because theos refers to God. All right. Amazing, huh? All right. At this time, he was a deeply committed Christian. And so he said, and I quote, "In the least doubt, the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible." And so he believed everything that was written in the Bible was verbatim. And so he didn't question any of that. And so he actually did graduate with a BA, Bachelor's of Arts in Theology. He also studied the geometry of Euclid, and he also picked up the classics. And so he had a very good, well-rounded education from Christ's College in Cambridge, England. All right. So what is he now going to do with his theology degree? He, however, had another interest. He was interested in geology. And so geology, which is earth science, is interested in the natural processes and different forces that are involved in forming and shaping the earth. And so he accompanied a professor by the name of Sedgwick in the summer of 1831 for a geology field trip aboard the HMS Beagle. And so he decided to spend his summer vacation studying geology with a professor of his. And so Darwin, however, was hired on as a naturalist. And so you can see the word nature within the word naturalist, and therefore you know that it's going to be dealing with nature and the natural world. And so this obviously would not only change his life, but it changed the course of science as well. And so before he left on his summer trip, he was reading a couple books. He read a book called The Essay on the Principles of Population by Thomas Malthus. And so we did talk a little bit about Malthus last semester when we're looking at ecology, specifically looking at populations. And also he studied multiple works by a Lyell. And so both of these gentlemen would also have a very big influence on Darwin's thoughts on evolution. All right, I want to start first with Thomas Malthus. And so his big idea was that all individuals within a population struggle against other individuals to obtain what is necessary in order to survive and reproduce. And so you need food, you need shelter, you need to have mates. And so if you remember, this type is known as competition. So resources are limited, there's only so much food and shelter, and so individuals will fight over those, and so that obviously had a very big impact on Darwin. All right. The other gentleman that he read up on was a gentleman by the name of Sir Charles Lyell. He, however, was highly controversial, and so I'm going to explain why. He was one of the first scientists who rejected the history of the world as told in the Old Testament. And so remember, at this point, Darwin believed everything that was written down in the Bible. So there was no doubt in his mind that there was nothing there that was false. This gentleman, however, was the first to question whether everything written in the Old Testament was true. So obviously had a very big backlash amongst the community. He tried to show that the same process we see at work today could, given eons and eons of time, so large, millions or billions of years, to produce all of the geological features in the world. He referred to this as the uniformitarian theory. And so his statement, the present is the key to the past. And so I do want to say that obviously the past does help shape both the present and the future, but given the same processes at work today, could it produce all the geological features in the world? I'm not so sure about that. And so obviously this would be something that you would need to do some research in. And so I don't take for what he's saying for literal either. And so we're going to go now on to the summer trip in 1831. Darwin's up on the ship with Professor Sedgwick aboard the HMS Beagle. He was there for 5 years. What he did during this 5-year time, he collected samples, and as a good scientist, he made observations of the species that were native to the particular island or landmass that they were on. And so one of the more famous of these animals is the Galapagos turtles. And so those were then very important for his theory. And so the observations and data collected on his voyage, plus the ideas of Malthus and Lyell, led Darwin to his grand theory of natural selection. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later. However, he was very worried about how the scientific community would take this, and so he decided not to publish it for 23 years. And so you might be asking yourself, why did he wait almost a quarter of a century before he published his now famous theory of natural selection? He wanted to perfect it. So he wanted to make sure that what he was saying, there was no sort of flaws or inconsistencies within it. And so his wife, who was also very religious, knew that if he were to publish this result, on the natural theory of natural selection, this would be devastating to the church. But eventually, he found out that if he didn't publish it, another person would publish it, and so this is referred to as being scooped in the research world. And so in the year 1859, Darwin did publish the theory of natural selection in his now famous book, The Origin of Species. I wanted to show you a couple pictures from the book. This is available at pretty much any bookstore or library, and so we could see that he was also quite the artist. So remember, he had a very enriched education, and so he studied the classics, he studied Euclid's Elements, he was a theologist, and so you can see that he did spend very good time documenting the physical characteristics of the different animals. Over here, we have the famous Darwin finches, and so we'll talk about that tomorrow and discuss how this fits in with this idea of natural selection. Darwin did not set himself up to be an anti-religion crusader. He did not seek to destroy religion. In fact, his works are even quite evenly handed. And so what he actually did, he was actually more critical of his own work than other scientists were critical of his work. And so he was his own worst enemy, as it were. And so he devoted more space to discussing the reasons a scientist might reject his main hypothesis than accepting it. And so pretty much opposite of what you would think any scientist would do. You would think that a scientist would want to support his theory no matter what. Darwin, however, spent more time showing why you shouldn't believe his theory. So he really was trying to be a balanced scientist. He was trying to look at both sides of the issue. And I think that is important even today, to always look at all the sides of an issue to make sure that you're looking at it correctly. And so he was, as we mentioned, a very careful, meticulous scientist, and it did, in fact, again, take him 23 years to perfect and publish his theory. And so it is important to keep that in mind. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that over this period of 23 years, he did start to lose his faith in God, unfortunately. I want to compare two statements that he made, one at the beginning on his voyage on the Beagle and one toward the end. At the beginning, he often bore the brunt of a good deal of laughter, and so from several of the officers for quoting the Bible as the final authority on some moral point. So whenever there was some sort of question that came up about how things go in life, Darwin would be the first there to quote a particular Bible verse, and so it brought a lot of laughter aboard the Beagle for that. However, towards the end of his life, Darwin seemed to get a little further away from God, and so this is a quote from him, quote, "The Old Testament from its manifest false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, the rainbow as a sign, etc., etc., and from its attributing to God the feeling is revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the sacred book of the Hindus," so this is one way that you could spell Hindus, "or the beliefs of any barbarian." So here's a guy who at one point said everything out of the Bible is true. Now he's criticizing the Bible as being false history. He didn't believe in the Tower of Babel. He didn't believe the rainbow was the sign after the Great Flood. And so he basically equated religion to that of other religions, such as the Hindu religions, or even of those of the barbarians. And so at this later point in his life, it seems that he had completely lost his faith in God, unfortunately. And so I'm going to finish up today by talking a little bit about the last days of Darwin. He did die in the year 1882 of some illness. He died as a celebrated naturalist who did change the face of science. And so where you will find him buried is in the famous Westminster Abbey, along with the physicist, the mathematician Sir Isaac Newton, and Lord William Thomas Kelvin, who is famous for the Kelvin scale of temperatures in science as well. And so We're going to go ahead and stop here for the day. Tomorrow, then, we'll talk a little bit more about the theory that Darwin presented. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.